Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. Hope you guys are doing well. This is Ramesh. In today's video, we have with us Dr. Suneel Dhand. Dr. Dhand is a physician specializing in internal medicine and metabolic health. He's also a certified personal trainer, an author, and a health advocate known for his outspoken views on the current state of the healthcare system, the public health policies, and medical ethics. And he frequently discusses challenges in modern healthcare, the problems with big pharma and big food and so on. So Dr. Dhand, thank you so much for joining us on the channel for today. How are you doing?
Oh, doing good, Ramesh. Thank you for that introduction. And looking forward to a really good discussion here. Lots to talk about.
For viewers who may not be familiar, Dr. Dhand is one of those rare doctors on social media today who give you tips on how to stay away from doctors, basically.
Absolutely, yes. This is a big part of what I do. So I went through medical school, like most people who go through that process. I was very bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. I had very idealistic views of medicine. This was in the United Kingdom where I grew up. My parents are from the north of India, from Punjab. They moved to England in the 1960s, so I was born in England, grew up there, went to medical school. Shortly afterwards, I made the choice to go to the United States for further training. I did my residency training in a city called Baltimore on the East Coast. Then I began life as a practicing doctor, what you would call MD, and I realized very quickly that so much of what we were seeing at the front lines was completely due to poor lifestyle. And it pained me to see all of this suffering. And since then, it's got obviously a lot worse. And I really don't want countries like India to go the same way.
Right.
But my interest in this was really piqued by everything that I was seeing and my desire to help people to avoid the fate of illness, which is terrible, and then all of the problems which come with aging, and to not see it as an inevitable path that as one gets older, they have to get sicker. There are many, many ways to prevent it. And to go back to your original point, the best life you can have is one which is away from doctors, one which is very healthy and a high sense of physical and mental well-being.
When I was growing up, I remember when I was young, when we would visit doctors, especially here in India, medical professionals and doctors would be sort of looked upon in a sort of a reverential way, like somebody there to heal us. But then of late, there's this growing awareness that the medical industry is exactly that. It's an industry, and they may actually not have our best interests at heart. So do you think that something changed along the way over the last few decades? Like what happened? Because obviously, I mean, not all doctors are the same. I'm sure there are good and bad people like in every industry. Where do you think it changed? Like how did it become from healing focused and patient focused to profit focused? Or was it always like this?
And obviously you're in a different system, and I'm familiar when relatives have got sick with the Indian system, and I know that it has its challenges, and there's probably more of a sense of cynicism over there because of the way doctors, you pay them directly, etc., and costs can be outrageous as well. There's not so much of an insurance system like the USA. In the UK, everything is free. I think that there were suspicions for a long time in countries for 1 or 2 decades that things were not as they seem, and the population is getting sicker, people are getting more and more drugged up, doctors are doing okay financially, and you're right that this is especially true in Indian culture. I believe this sort of reverence of doctors. I grew up with it. That's probably a reason why I became a doctor. Maybe it was put into my head very early by my parents that this was a very good profession. And don't get me wrong, I think probably most doctors out there go into it with noble intentions. They want to do a good job, and they aren't driven by the pursuit of money. But things can change very, very quickly, especially as you go through medical school, you graduate, you face certain other life pressures, especially in countries like the USA, where doctors are hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. I would say that the pandemic, in the West anyway, really heightened people's awareness that things were not as they seem, that you shouldn't revere the medical profession, you shouldn't revere any profession without actually judging every individual. We have good and bad apples, and I'm sad to say that I believe the bad apples ruled our pandemic response. And
Right.
you combine an acute event like the pandemic with a growing awareness on social media where people connect more, where voices can grow louder and louder. Obviously, we've had some big political events over the last couple of weeks in the USA, and you get a mix of people, I would say, who have become very cynical about the medical industry. And I would say that's quite right. I think that the forces of bad right now, unfortunately, outweigh a lot of the forces of good. I can only speak for the USA and UK, but I would say there is a great deal of mistrust now of medicine, far more than there was 10 or 20 years ago. And I agree with that. As a doctor,
Right.
I'm ashamed, but as you know from many of my videos and what I say online, I truly am. I'm at a loss with what my profession has become. I believe that we're ruled by the wrong people who have zero interest in health and well-being. They're driven solely by money. And I think the medical profession mindlessly follows protocol in the USA and UK. They will do whatever their doctor societies tell them to do without even asking the basic questions. Where are these guidelines coming from? Are they driven by money changing hands, which they are a lot of the time? And we're in a very sad situation. Ultimately, I feel sorry for the patients because those are the ones who suffer, the majority of which don't have a strong voice and they don't have a lot of medical education. So they're kind of relying on the medical profession, which is failing them.
Right. And I have to add, it's kind of similar in India as well, because I know you speak for the US and UK, but even though of course there's a lot of research and independent investigation that happens in India, a lot of the systems that are followed and the standards that are followed here are derived directly or indirectly from a Western sort of a passed on from the US or the UK. So some of the situation is actually identical. But then when you speak of the industry not having the best interests of patients at heart, well, obviously it's not a monolith. It's like one everybody acting together, with evil intentions. Obviously, there are some people with profit and greed, but then also I feel like the system, the way it's set up. Let's say a young person joins, the force with intentions of healing and whatnot,
Good
but then
intentions.
he's the cost of becoming a doctor and the medical profession is so forbiddingly expensive that there's
Mm.
debt, like you said, and then in his practice, of course, he has to somehow make money, and it sort of becomes profit oriented for him as well. Like it sort of perpetuates through
It
the
does.
system.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. Yeah, and doctors have their own responsibilities. They have life goals. They might have a family.
Right.
I still don't accept. I hear this excuse a lot, but at the end of the day, this is how every bad thing has happened throughout history. There's a famous saying from the 1800s that all it takes for bad things to happen, for evil to flourish, is for good people to do nothing. And I'm at the stage now, Ramesh, where I don't accept the excuse that, oh, we're just a cog in the wheel. We'll just accept everything. As far as I'm concerned, anybody who's intelligent enough to become a doctor should know better. And they have a duty to speak out. And I'm ashamed to say that most doctors don't. They will mindlessly do what they are told. And I think there's a systemic problem which runs deeper in the profession, that
Right.
doctors are not taught critical thinking. They're not intellectually curious. They've forgotten about a lot of the basic principles of science in favor of just memorizing things and doing what they are told. I could tell you so many stories from the pandemic which would absolutely shock you. May I share one with you?
Of course, yeah,
Particular.
please.
So, when the vaccines were first released in December 2020, I wrote a blog piece on my thoughts. I had actually taken the time. It took 10 minutes to read the medical paper. 10 minutes, that's it. And I could critically appraise it immediately. And I wrote a piece and I said, these are my concerns that the vaccine is not going to stop transmission. It may make a small difference. I'm concerned about the new technology, and I don't think these trials ran for long enough. I mean, trials are supposed to run for years, and we've done it in a few months. You can't rush things in medicine. So I wrote this blog piece, and I was absolutely attacked. And I remember at the time, all of my colleagues, doctors I knew, were busy posting on social media their pictures. I'm vaccinated. This is the end. And I was thinking, how could you think it's the end? Like, did you not read the paper? This is not going to end anything. COVID is with us forever. And I would ask my colleagues and doctors I met online, I would say, did you actually read the paper? Overwhelmingly, I'd say 90% of doctors hadn't even read the paper. And I would think, what are you basing your opinions on then? Do you just reading the mainstream media headline? Just doing what somebody's told you? Why have you not read the paper? And then I decided I would do a test every few months when things panned out exactly as I said they would. I kept asking, did you read the original paper? And overwhelmingly again, the answer was no. And I would bet you still to this day, practicing doctors have not taken 10 minutes to critically appraise the paper. And I'm thinking to myself, and this may sound very pessimistic, you're a doctor, you have a medical degree, you went to school for 5, 6 years, you had the biggest medical story of your lifetime, and you couldn't even be bothered to spend 10 minutes reading the
Right.
paper. What hope is there for the general public if a doctor can't even do that?
Right.
It may sound very negative, but that's what I'm telling you. We are dealing with a very overwhelmingly lazy profession who wants to follow protocol and they don't want to think for themselves. It's a huge problem. I'm sure it's the same in India.
Right. And somehow in this whole thing, unwittingly, doctors end up becoming the sort of unofficial spokespersons, or, like I remember this little quote that I wrote down from this book called Disease Mongers from Lynn Payer in 1992. About how doctors, insurers, marketing people, the whole medical professionals, they become the unofficial sales force for the drug industry.
Yeah,
And they sort
exactly.
of try to convince essentially well people that they are sick, or slightly sick people that they are very ill.
Yep, good way of putting it.
And often to the point of changing or fudging metrics to make it look like what could be a normal condition can be sort of this hyper categorization, categorized as a new disorder, so that they can sell new drugs.
Yeah, this is the whole paradigm which is broken. And this goes back decades to the beginning of the 20th century, a fellow called Rockefeller in the United States who wanted the whole of medicine to be uprooted, there to be a centralized education system. He wanted to get rid of a lot of the traditional cures which Native American Indians had used for centuries. And he wanted what we call a pill for every ill. And I would say that this sort of philosophy started to gather pace, but I believe it's got a lot worse over the last 20 years. Even when I went to medical school, the mantra was that you were very conservative with giving out medicines. It was only when absolutely needed. This was in the United Kingdom. And my whole philosophy when I was going through school was, okay, I'm a doctor. I'm going to be there for somebody when they're sick. I'll treat them, and then that's it, the end. But now the mantra has shifted towards getting millions and millions of people on these chronic medicines for life. And when you look at
Right.
the actual benefits of many of these medicines, they're absolutely tiny compared to lifestyle changes. But we have a medical paradigm which is broken in that doctors nowadays think that the answer to everything is to just dole out a chemical formulation. And that's a fundamentally broken premise. And unfortunately, because doctors think like that, patients also think like that. I'll give you an example: type 2 diabetes, which I know is exploding in India.
Right.
Very, very rare condition. 60 years ago, our grandparents, very unusual to have type 2 diabetes. Now teenagers are getting it. And if you got type 2 diabetes 70 or 80 years ago, the doctor would be really blunt with you and say, you have to fix your life, cut out carbohydrates, go and exercise and lose weight. And the type 2 diabetes would reverse within several weeks. But now the whole philosophy is, oh, we can just throw pills at it. And it's ludicrous. You might fix a number, you might lower the sugar, but the original problem is still there. that you
Right.
are destroying your body primarily with what you're eating, all that inflammation is still taking place. And the answer is never going to be a pill. But millions of people out there think that that's going to be the answer for them. And they'll
Right.
still get all the complications and they'll just keep getting sicker and sicker and having more and more pills piled upon them. It's an absolutely ridiculous situation.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned pills, and this there's a sort of a reductive thinking where everything is broken down, which is kind of the scientific way to you break down and you study and everything. But then when I contrast this with, say, like you mentioned, like traditional, native medicines that people used to follow, like in something like Ayurveda, for example, one contrast. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but then one difference I see is how remedies are not they're not very specific. They're more sort of a broad spectrum. For example, if you have a herb, they
Mm.
have an active ingredient, but they also have a whole bunch of other things which don't just heal that specific thing, but they also balance many other systems in the body. And so I have a background in chemistry. I did my master's in chemistry, so I understand the concept of homeostasis or equilibrium, and how the human body is like a complex mix of so many different systems in equilibrium. And in the case of disorder or disease, so if you imagine one system, overacting or going out of balance, I would say traditional medicine is not specific in that it just doesn't affect that particular system, but it sort of tries to set the whole system back in balance, the metabolic axis,
Absolutely.
as it were.
Yeah.
Whereas in modern medicine, the active ingredient from this is taken and isolated and imparted just to, it's highly specific and just treats that particular system, and the
Yeah.
whole thing, the imbalance is sort of, you know maintained in some way, I guess. I don't know if that
Exactly.
makes sense.
That's a really smart way to put it, Ramesh. I'll probably use that explanation at some point. I really love that. Yeah, you're right. Another way of thinking about this is, say, a hole in a wall caused by an infestation. And you can imagine it. Imagine you've got termites.
Right.
You have the same term in India, termites in a
Yeah, yeah,
wall.
yeah.
Yeah. And they caused a hole in the wall. And modern medicine, our modern philosophy of treating, is to simply put a picture over the hole.
Right.
And doctors get very happy and think they fix it, but hold on a minute. Behind the picture, the termites are still exploding, and with time they're going to break through that too. So
Right.
that's what most modern medicine, whether we're talking about statin or diabetes medicine, you're simply putting a picture over the hole. That's it. You're not dealing with root causes.
Right.
You can't.
And
The fundamental issue is that you can't treat a food-based illness with a disease, with a medicine. You have to treat it by fixing the food.
right. Yeah. And of course it helps that by doing that, you also make them keep them, they keep coming back to you every time the
Exactly.
problem,
Yeah.
so
And you
there's a
keep
steady
making
stream
money
of
and they
income.
keep getting complications. Like this happens everywhere in the US. I'm sure it happens in India where you have somebody
Right.
who's severely overweight, keeps loading their bodies with sugars and carbs every single day. And the doctor will say, "Oh, you've got a heart problem. Go to a cardiologist." Then a lung problem, see the lung specialist. Oh, now you've got a gut problem, see the gastroenterologist. And they'll see 5 different specialists, and no one has put it together and said, we're not going to fix anything until this person actually stops putting poison into their body every single day.
Right.
And
Right.
doctors are on board with it and seem to be okay with this mantra of just throwing pills and injections at, quite frankly, it's a losing battle. You can't win because the person is going to keep on doing that. Whereas that same person, if they lived 70 years ago, probably would have had a stern talking to, and doctors would have said, we can't do anything for you. You have to stop eating rubbish. And
Right.
ironically, they would have had much more chance of doing that because they would have had societal pressure too. But now the whole modern mainstream culture doesn't even exert that type of pressure on people to eat the right food. We think
Right.
that people can do whatever you want and face no consequence. It's a
Right.
deep-seated cultural issue too.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to touch upon food as well a little later, but then just staying with the medical community. One point I was reading is how the metrics are adjusted to make something that's normal look like it's like abnormal. And I know that you made a video on blood pressure, right, just
Yeah,
recently. I remember watching it, and how reference values for blood pressure are calculated, and how what was normal before has now become pre-hypertension or so, and
exactly. Yeah.
and there's a sort of a manipulation of even. So I've always wondered, when you go take blood tests, there are these reference ranges in which is considered to be healthy, but where does this reference range come from, and how was it measured? And just by moving, and I know people, for example, in whose blood values may look like they are like borderline or even high in with certain readings, but then they're actually healthy and happy and doing fine, you know. So there's also a lesson in not just blindly adopting some value which may no longer apply to you in your lifestyle or the kind of life you lead, right?
Yeah,
Does that
absolutely,
make sense?
exactly. Yeah, and this is well driven from the top, at least in the US and UK, by financial motivations to get people on medicines earlier.
Right.
But again, I mean, blood pressure. Almost 100% of people with high blood pressure below the age of 60 have insulin resistance. So we're coming back again to the food situation.
Right.
And yes, the guidelines get tougher and tougher, but they're also trying to do the same thing, pile medicines on people who have a very, very poor diet. But I
Right.
don't doubt that even some of those people are being overtreated right now.
So coming to food then, like what is your opinion on, so they seem to go hand in hand, right? Like big pharma and big food. So there's
Cool.
this, and even in India, for example, people who would eat truly local and traditional food are
Yeah.
adopting food that is not really, you know, based on their culture or good for their bodies, and from the West. And that's also contribute. I mean, if you look at India, India has these traditional medicines and Ayurveda and so many systems, and yet it is called the diabetes capital of the world because of these of the lifestyle that is adopted without thinking from a
Yeah.
different system, basically.
Very true. I'm very familiar with India's problems, and I think a lot of this goes back to, yes, the westernization of the diet, more and more processed foods, sugars, huge amounts of sugars in the Indian diet. I believe the South is even worse than the North.
Right.
And you combine this with people being much more sedentary than they were a few years ago, and you get this lethal mix. But yeah, there's a lot of people. Obviously, a lot of people are vegetarian in India. I'm vegetarian myself, and one of the biggest problems with many vegetarians is the fact that they eat way too many carbs and sugars to
Right.
make up for, and not enough protein, sadly.
Right. Right. So yeah, I was going to ask you that. So when it comes to healthy eating, what do you think is healthier? I mean, is there like an easy answer there, or is it better to stick to being a vegetarian and find alternate sources? Or
Well, being vegetarian, obviously I'm vegetarian myself. There's plenty of ways to be a healthy vegetarian, but the number one rule that anybody out there can follow, anyone who's listening, is to eat as natural as possible. Cook from scratch with real ingredients. Foods which come in packages, which I know are taking off in India, are
right.
loaded with artificial ingredients, what we call processed ingredients that our bodies are not built for. They're full of sugars, seed oils. So it's very hard to go wrong if you're eating natural foods, which are which have a healthy mix of nutrients. Where you have to be particularly careful in India is the carbohydrate load. So whether
Right.
that's rice, whether that's paratha, roti, be very, very careful. And protein intake is also notoriously low in India. So I personally, I eat a lot of eggs and dairy, and that's where I get most of my protein from. So I would advise people in India, if they can eat eggs, eggs are absolutely fantastic for your health. Dairy is okay as long as you can tolerate it. Paneer is okay, but the number one thing to do is eat as natural as possible. Be very, very careful of those sugars, and also in what you drink as
Right.
well. Um, Sodas are very popular in India. Again, they're often packed with sugar, sadly. So
Right.
there's no ideal diet for absolutely everyone, but if you adhere to those broad principles, eat real food, be mindful of not eating too many carbs and sugars, maximize protein intake. For most people, it should be as close to 1.5 grams per kilogram every day.
Right.
So a 70-kilo person should try to get around 110 grams of protein every day, real protein.
Right. And and what's your take on gluten? Because I know that there's a lot of gluten intolerance in not everybody, in a small percentage of the population, but then something like a gluten-free option is touted to be healthier than something with gluten. Is that really true? Because I always felt that it's only a problem in a small percentage. You don't actually have to avoid gluten at all, right? Unless you have that specific problem.
Exactly, you don't have to, and I'm not suggesting you avoid all carbs completely and go keto, but certainly if you're going gluten free, I even if you're not intolerant to gluten, there's probably no downsides of doing it, but I don't think you have to necessarily be gluten free.
So even recently there was an article, I don't know if you read that, like an article that said how processed food is not bad. I think there was a lot of
Yeah.
backlash regarding that article. I think maybe even you addressed that in one of your videos. So how there's this concerted, just like big pharma, there's this big food industry trying to process and funnel so much of money into promoting basically unhealthy food habits, right?
Yeah, this is the big elephant in the room, that all of the financial motivations to keep people eating wrong food, whereas our grandparents may have just had simple rice with some dal. Now
Right.
people have access to all this other type of food produced by food corporations. It's a billion, trillion-dollar industry. I mean, in every country, this has become huge because people need to eat. And these companies are very good at making industrially processed products. I don't even consider them food most of the time, but they are deliberately made very addictive. So they
Hyper
taste good,
palatable, no? They're called hyper
exactly,
palatable.
hyper palatable. But if you look at the ingredient labels, which I would also advise everybody to get into the habit of doing, once you see it, you can't unsee it. But before you buy anything, look at the ingredient label. What does it contain? Does it have a ridiculous amount of sugar? Has it got a lot of the artificial oils in it? And once you start doing this, you will be a whole new person as a result. And I would urge everybody out there, why would you want to pour toxins into your body? You have this one body, it's a gift from God. Treat it well, and don't let food corporations with their hyper palatable foods get you. So please, please read those ingredient labels. I know that you have them in India as well, and ideally there should be no ingredient labels. You should be cooking from scratch. If you have to
Right.
buy processed food, buy minimal ingredients, ideally three or less. And if there's anything that you don't recognize on the label, I'd advise you not to eat it.
Right. But this is a good point because I don't know how well reading ingredients on a label would work here, because I know that in the West it's sort of enforced by law to list every single thing on a packet. Whereas here, although I think I'm not really sure, maybe it exists on paper, but I don't know how far it's followed, because you can very easily find products on a shelf which have very minimal information, or they could all sort of bunch them under an umbrella term saying permitted
Yeah.
flavors and colors or something without specifying
Oh, I
what
see.
that is.
Okay.
So there's not really no way for people to sort of discern what they're eating, because this sort of very hidden under these layers of verbiage and technical jargon, so to speak.
Yep. So you have to be very even more careful then in
Right.
India. But
Yeah.
in India, thankfully, unlike the West, the UK or US, India actually has very, very good native food, extremely
That's true.
tasty. So if people are cooking from scratch with fresh vegetables, etc., it's difficult to go wrong. So another reason to eat in as much as possible, and we have to be realistic about it. I know everybody, especially young people, are not going to eat in all the time, and everybody wants to go out and have fun. But be mindful of this and make the cheat meals an exception, not a rule.
Right. And you mentioned cooking at home by yourself. So what the big question is fats, right? Somehow fats are demonized much more than they should be, and carbs are allowed. So the question is, what kind of fats do you think are good in the sense like I know you mentioned processed seed oils are obviously bad, but then what would
Yeah.
you cook with?
I'm not a fan of any of those seed oils like canola oil, sunflower oil. I'm very skeptical of them. So my favorites to cook with would be either extra virgin olive oil,
Right,
butter, ghee is okay, and other oils which evidence shows are relatively stable, avocado oil and coconut oil. So those
right,
would be my favorites. Usually, I personally use extra virgin olive oil and cook with that lightly
right,
fry.
right. And what's your your take on taste? Speaking of food, of course,
Yeah, yeah, taste good.
take on fasting, because I remember. So this is a very line that was driven into my head by my mum growing up. This is actually a Sanskrit line. I think it comes from one of the ancient like Ayurvedic texts, which says that langanam paramaushadam, which means that fasting is the greatest medicine. You know how a lot of the imbalances can be sort of, you can allow them to sort of
Yeah,
reset if you don't continue to feed and don't continue to consume.
yeah, yeah. Fantastic. Your mother, a wise statement there, wise lady. So basically, fasting evidence is increasingly showing works wonders for your body. It basically rests your metabolism. And I'm a big fan of fasting, even in people who are not trying to lose weight. In people who I'm advising to lose weight, it can be absolutely transformative because basically, most people nowadays who are overweight or obese are insulin resistant. And they become that way because their insulin spikes too many times during the day. And
Right,
what happens when you fast is your insulin levels stay low. So the more your insulin levels stay low, because insulin is the fat storage hormone, the less likely you are to put on weight. So some common strategies for intermittent fasting or time restricted eating, typically eating within a 7 to 8 hour window. So something like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., which would mean that for 16 hours, your body is completely resting. And I'm
right.
not suggesting you have to do it every day, but once in a while, yeah, if you could do a 16-hour fast, very, very good for you.
And 16 is the minimum that you need to let your body enter autophagy, right? I mean, or 16 or more.
Not necessarily. I mean, even a 12 to 14-hour fast would be okay. This is not an exact science, but the
Right,
principle is to try not to keep your pancreas and liver stimulated, and you are resting it as you got from that Sanskrit phrase
right,
overnight. I mean, everybody has a fast anyway. That's why it's called breakfast, first thing in the morning. Most
right.
people find it easier if they're going to fast to just have breakfast later, like 11 or 12 o'clock. But if you can do that a couple of days a week, that would be, even if you're doing like a 13 or 14-hour fast, you're at least giving your body a break. I think a good strategy is to not wake up and just start eating first thing. That's definitely not advisable or good for you.
Right. That was going to be my next question, because do the time windows matter? Because from my own experience, maybe it's different for different people. From my own experience, so when I started intermittent fasting, I found it was easier to quit breakfast and not so much dinner, because dinner was such a social experience. You go out in the evening,
Yeah.
meet people, and so on. It was difficult to quit. But then I found out that eating before sleep was much more harmful for me personally. I wasn't feeling so well, getting good sleep. And over a period of time, I trained myself to not skip breakfast and somehow force myself to skip having late meals. So I
Mm.
usually have like a breakfast and a lunch or late lunch, and I skip eating towards the end. So do you think your metabolic cycle obviously varies throughout the day, how well you're able to
Yeah.
digest? So
Yeah.
should does that also matter, obviously, right?
Yeah, not really. I mean, if you, as long as you're fasting, it's okay. Whatever works for people. So if that works for you, skipping dinner and breakfast, that's fine. You're still resting your body. Most people find it easier to skip breakfast and
Right,
then have like lunch and dinner. But if that works for you, that's completely fine.
right, right. And staying on the topic of food, I want your views on organic food. You know, now it's become a sort of a trend or a fashion, and organic products are usually more expensive than the typical pesticide laden
Exactly.
products. But then I also know that organic is actually a technical term because it doesn't mean it's completely free of chemical. It's just that they define a certain, allowed percentage, and if it's below that, it's certified as organic. So is something truly organic in that sense, or how does that work? Can we trust anything labeled organic?
So this is interesting. You're telling me organic is a trend in India as well?
Also, yeah, it's a growing trend. Yeah.
A growing trend, yeah. So I'm a fan of it. In the US, we always try to buy organic. In the UK as well. You have to be able to trust where it's coming from, though. So
Right.
yeah, if the rules are lax, that kind of negates the whole reason why you would do this. Because the idea is that you want food which is free of pesticides and other chemicals. So
Right.
you have to be in a
So
place where you can trust that labeling. But yeah, of course, it's better for you to have natural food free of those artificial agents.
right. I guess what I was trying to say was, so like a packet may come labeled as certified organic, but then
Yeah,
what does that mean? Because organic does it mean 0%, for example, zero
yeah,
heavy metals, or like there is a fine print which says that up to a certain amount is allowed, and it becomes organic when it's below that and not above that level, right? So it's not like completely
yeah.
devoid of it.
So yeah, it varies according to what country you're in.
Right.
What it is. So in the US and UK, there's strict rules, but particularly with regards to chemicals and pesticides you can use. I'd have to research the heavy metal issue.
Okay.
But you can be quite sure because the laws are there. I mean, obviously, you may have some bad players, but in the US and UK, if you're buying organic food, it is
Right.
not going to be as chemically laden as the regular food items, and you can taste it. They even look different as well.
Right.
So
Right.
it's there for you to taste.
But why does it become so expensive though? Because you imagine that with less processing and less cost with pesticides and everything, it should be cheaper, right?
Not necessarily because the processing also makes it all an industrial loop which mass produces everything. And also it takes longer. So my understanding is a lot of these chemicals make everything grow faster. And if you're growing organic, some of those food items might get destroyed by insects, etc. So that's
Right.
why it ends up more expensive and it takes up more space as well. Yeah. So it's a much more it's a process that involves a lot more manpower.
So
But I
just
would still
moving,
say, like, people shouldn't get too hung up on it because I know cost is a big issue. So
right.
the number one thing practically people can do is at least try to eat a vegetable, whether it's organic or not, instead of the chocolate or the bag of chips.
Right. Right. So basically, do you think a lot of, so one thing that people look at is calories, right? So do calories really matter, or is it what form they come in? For example, obviously it's better to eat a piece of fruit for dessert instead of a gelato, even if the calorie content may be equivalent, right? So how does
I
that?
agree. I agree to an extent. I mean, calories are not completely useless or meaningless because at the end of the day, it's a law of thermodynamics. If you're consistently putting in more than you put out, you will gain weight. So I'll give you an example. If you could eat 3,000 calories of broccoli and you burnt only 2,000, but you ate 1,000 calories of chips and you put out 2,000, then you'll still lose weight eating chips. You see what I'm saying? But the
Right.
point is, it's very difficult to eat 3,000 calories of broccoli. That would just be too much because it's not a very calorie dense food. But it's very easy to eat 3,000 calories of chips.
Right. Right. But isn't there, just to go a little deeper in that,
Yeah,
isn't there this also this energy cost of digestion? For example, the calories of chips are so much more easily available and released and bioavailable
yeah,
than say broccoli, which are like complex organic molecules which have to be broken down, and hence there's a little bit of extra work to
exactly.
be done by the body, and the fiber of the broccoli obviously is going to take care of so many other things which the chips won't.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, good point. Yeah. If you consistently, the example was that no matter what you're eating, you can't be taking in more than you're putting out. I mean, people can still get very overweight eating too many bowls of dal every day if they're not
Right.
exercising because it's still calories going in. You have to
Right.
have that balance, but it's still harder. They'll probably gain less weight than if they were eating the chips or the pizza.
We speak of food and the importance of medicine, but then what about the healing power of the body? So a lot of the traditional systems that you know prescribe herbs and so on, so they existed at a time when the scientific method wasn't available. Nobody actually tested these things in the lab, and that over many years of trial and error, I guess they found out what works, and they have this uh, they sort of in a way allowed the body to intuitively let them know what's good and what's bad, and how you get better. So I feel like we've sort of medicated common sense and intuition out of ourselves in a way, right? Would you agree? And how do you connect back so that you know what's good for you, which is, I think, is the main problem, where people don't know anymore what's good for them.
They don't, and it's a big problem. This is not going to be an easy fix, Ramesh, because we've moved so far away from nature and we've got so used to living an artificial lifestyle that we've lost touch with our bodies completely. I
Right.
would say that the best way is that people start feeling better very quickly. I've worked with people, I've coached people on cutting out processed foods, and within a month they are a whole new person. And it's very sad. It was put very well by a famous podcaster in the United States that so many people just feel terrible all the time because they're eating junk, they're not moving around, and they think that's normal, especially young people. They've
Right.
never actually felt good before. So this is not going to be an easy nut to crack.
I know that metabolism also can be tricky, and I'm sure you'll agree that it's highly adaptable, right? Because I remember that when I was trying to lose weight, the people like when I was trying to fast, people were telling me, just listen to your body and then eat when you have to eat, and don't make too much issue out of it. But then the problem is, the more, from my experience, I'm not a doctor, the more you eat, the body seems to adapt, and sort of the baseline increases, and then
Yeah.
one day if you don't eat, you feel hungry, but then that's not real hunger, and you shouldn't listen to it, right?
Yeah, yeah. And this is the problem. If people are overweight or obese, their natural levels of hunger, etc., have all been reset to somewhere different, and it's a lot of work. You can reset it back, but yeah, the advice would be if you're on a health journey, if you're trying to lose weight, for instance, or reverse type 2 diabetes, you can't just act on that impulse.
Right.
There has to be a block there, that's the whole difficult part of this issue.
You as a doctor, like in your own practice, now that you're passionate about this cause, of healing people, do you still operate as a normal doctor? I mean, you have a clinic, and then you meet people, or and then do you prescribe medicines to them, or how has your approach changed, and how do you deal with people who come to you?
Well, I work as a hospital doctor, so people come in with acute conditions like
Okay.
severe infection or heart failure or bronchitis. So you have to treat them because they're acutely unwell. And modern medicine, although I've criticized it a lot, there are some good aspects. I think we're very good at fixing acute problems quickly. So if someone has an overwhelming infection, then you treat them with antibiotics. And then my job as a hospital doctor is to discharge them. In my outpatient practice, I coach on lifestyle medicine. So I don't prescribe any medicines at all. It's all helping people with lifestyle change.
What is your way of promoting this kind of lifestyle? You mentioned that you don't prescribe medicines, but how would you approach this problem? Like of bringing people back, and sort of looking at health in a holistic way. Like, I know there's no silver bullet, like you said, but
There's no silver bullet. I mean, through my own work, my online content, which you've seen, I want to plant that seed in people because they may not have been getting it from their doctors, that there is another way. If you're somebody that looks in the mirror, you're unhappy with how you look, if you come home from work exhausted every day, and it's not because necessarily the job is bad, if you are just getting more and more tired, if you're feeling more stressed, you're feeling more anxious, and if you've been given some bad news by your doctor that your blood pressure is up, your cholesterol is up, over 90% of the time, all of those issues are due to your lifestyle. And you don't have to go down the route of getting sucked into the medical industrial complex. You're only going to get sicker every year. And I want to show you a different way that is entirely natural, abiding by some key principles, many of which we've discussed in terms of diet, exercise. I'm also a personal trainer, as you said at the beginning, sleeping well, working on stress in your life, thinking about other life goals. Those are all of the holistic pillars of health and well-being. And if you're motivated, if you want to make this change, your life can look completely different in just 4 weeks or so.
Do you think the situation is kind of irredeemable in the sense that, for example, I remember reading that they have begun to detect microplastics and forever chemicals, not just in the oceans and environment, but also in the human body, in blood, in the human brain. It's already, it's already here. So is there any hope of finding food that is truly healthy and organic, or truly being able to live a healthy lifestyle because they've already been infiltrated and the system's been compromised? What do you think?
I like to be an optimist. I would
Right.
never say never do anything. We're in a bad situation in the United States. I mean, here, the levels of obesity and chronic disease are off the charts. Over the last 5 years, especially, you have to see it to believe it. The rates of disease and obesity in particular. I think it's very difficult to come back from it now. We might be past the point of no return. We have thankfully had some political developments over the last couple of weeks, and we have some people at the top of government who potentially are very big on this issue of trying to make the country healthier again.
Right.
So you never know. Throughout history, pendulums swing back and forth. I mean, this is something that is in our ancient Indian culture, that everything is in equilibrium and things swing back and forth. And I think humanity has probably been in worse situations. I mean, we've been through world wars and famines and plagues. I think we can come back from this, but it's going to take a monumental effort. My big hope is that other countries don't follow suit. India is fast going the wrong way. I know China is as well. But there is an opportunity to put the brakes on before you get to the state of the United States. A country cannot succeed. Latest statistics show that under 10% of the USA is metabolically healthy right now. There's just complete devastation, and the costs of this are in the trillions of dollars. And no country can succeed. 50% of teenagers now have pre-diabetes. So can you imagine how much sickness there'll be in 10 years' time?
Right.
The biggest exploding condition for pediatricians in the US is type 2 diabetes. A few decades ago, a pediatrician used to go their whole career, they would never see type 2 diabetes. And now it's the number one condition in their clinic. So this is unsustainable, truly unsustainable. So
Right.
something is going to break. Either the country will fall off a cliff, or hopefully we get good political leadership. But I hope that your viewers in India can really take note. And if you love your country, don't let it go down this road. It's a very dark road to go down.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much for that insight and all the the discussion on this topic. And since we're running out of time, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Suneel. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.